Tornadoes, whirlwinds, cyclones, whatever you call them, these forces of nature can be majestic to behold. However, they can also be terrifying. A tempest ripped straight out of a nightmare. The intensity of any given tornado is ranked on the Enhanced Fujita scale, which is based off the severity of damage that a tornado causes. The scale runs from EFU, or unknown, to EF5, which is a ranking that indicates incredible damage. Luckily, EF5s are extremely rare. In fact, there hasn't been a single EF5 in well over a decade now. However, it's unfortunately only a matter of time before one of these monsters strike again. These storms are so intense that it can actually be quite difficult to find the words to even describe them. However, my personal favorite description of an EF5 comes from the fantastic 1996 film Twister.
Is there an F5? What would that be like?
The finger of God.
The Finger of God, a both beautiful and terrifying description, but it's accurate. There's something truly otherworldly about these storms. Their sheer strength and violence can snatch your breath away. Over the years, there have been many EF5s that have caused incredible damage to both property and life. However, in my humble opinion, there is one storm that stands above the rest as the most utterly terrifying, and that's the storm that we'll be covering today. On the 27th of May of the year 1997, 27 lives would vanish in just a matter of mere moments. In the days leading up to this disaster, meteorologists would forecast a high likelihood of severe thunderstorms for the area surrounding Jarrell, Texas. This caused the Storm Prediction Center to activate a moderate risk of tornadoes for the immediate area. However, within a violent storm season, this particular cell didn't really stand out to anyone as especially concerning. On the morning of the 27th, Jarrell Texas residents woke to blue skies. No one could have guessed that severe weather was on its way. However, by midday, storms began to pop up to the northeast. And yet, despite the fact that these storms were indeed very powerful, the risk for tornadoes remained relatively low. However, what meteorologists couldn't have predicted were the subtle but significant fluctuations that were taking place in the atmosphere surrounding these storms. Now, normally, these fluctuations would just fizzle out and end up going nowhere. However, with just the right ingredients and the perfect conditions present, they could instead spell disaster. And it wouldn't be long before conditions continued to worsen. To the northeast of Jarrell, near Waco, Texas, a single storm had suddenly become dominant, and this storm was gradually moving to the southwest, the complete opposite direction that your typical thunderstorm would normally travel. And this would be the first hint that this storm was highly unusual. At approximately 1 p.m. that same afternoon, the first funnel cloud would appear, and only minutes later, a full-blown tornado would touch down near Moody, Texas. This tornado would prove to be yet another sign of strange behavior from this storm. The tempest would buzz around a nearby field before destroying a single mobile home and then dissipating. But just 20 minutes later, another tornado would descend from the clouds. And over the course of the next half hour or so, 3 more tornadoes would touch down. I think it's safe to say that at first, storm chasers in the area were having a blast on that fateful day. Luckily, all of these tornadoes would prove to be extremely weak, and no fatalities were reported. However, by 3 p.m., the initial storm cell was only 5 miles outside of Jarrell, and it was drawing closer with every passing minute. And it wouldn't be long before another tornado descended from the heavens. This one was extremely thin and needle-like in appearance. However, do not allow its benign looks to lull you into a false sense of security. This was a truly strong storm. Within that narrow funnel, the winds were roaring. The tempest proceeded to shred anything in its path, which luckily consisted mostly of just farm equipment and trees. However, by shredding these, the base of the funnel became shrouded in dust and debris. Soon, though, residents in the area were able to breathe a sigh of relief as this tornado ultimately disappeared into the sky just like the others. However, they weren't off the hook, because all of these weaker tornadoes had simply been Mother Nature's warm-up act. In less than a minute after the disappearance of the last tornado, a new beast began to form. And initially, this one took the shape of a large cone. And here is where the unusualness of the storm would strike again. Within the base of the vortex, storm chasers and bystanders alike began to notice the presence of several other funnels, making this a multi-vortex tornado. Now, this is a highly interesting phenomenon. While multi-vortexes can actually be quite common, in this case, their presence signaled the utter severity of this storm. The residents of Jarrell Texas were about to come face to face with a true monster. Nearby, at Jarrell Farm Supply, a man named Scott Beckwith was working. Stepping outside the building, Scott spotted the monster in the sky. Immediately, the man ran back inside to grab his camera and take photos of the incredible occurrence that he was witnessing. These images would reveal a thin, picturesque twister dancing in the sky. I mean, just look at these. Truly incredible shots. However, the final images reveal something much more concerning. What was once a thin and rope-like funnel had grown dramatically. And over the next few photos, the vortex only continued to grow in size, which would eventually lead us to one of the most infamous images of a tornado ever taken. The dead man walking. The multi-vortexes surrounding the main funnel almost appear as legs, as though the tornado is actually striding across the earth towards its intended victims. And in just mere minutes, this beast would arrive in Jarrell. Within a nearby field, the ground is literally scoured away, revealing the bedrock beneath. Ground scouring like this only occurs in the strongest of storms. Unfortunately, the first victims of the monster would be a herd of cows grazing in another nearby field. Reportedly, the strength of the wind literally ripped the flesh from their bones, skinning them alive. Truly horrific stuff. This area would also be the location of the next home destroyed by the tornado. The winds tore it to shreds as the family who resided there cowered in their storm shelter. However, even underground, they weren't entirely safe. The ferocious winds would actually rip the door of the storm shelter completely off of its hinges, and it would never be seen again. The next victim would be a farmhouse located on County Road 308. The twister proceeded to utterly demolish every single structure standing on this property, including a well-made barn and grain silos. Luckily, no deaths or even injuries would come from this. By now, considering all of the dirt and debris the tornado has consumed, its appearance has changed once again. It is now nearly jet black in color, and more ominous looking than ever. At this point, the width of the tornado has reached nearly 3/4 of a mile across. Nothing lying in its path would stand a chance. The twister now crossed into a subdivision known as the Double Creek Estates. But first, the monster would bear down upon a local recycling plant. Walls crumbled like tissue paper, Steel structures were snapped in half, and asphalt was literally ripped away from the nearby roads, making traveling even more perilous than it already was. And all the while, conditions outside only continued to worsen. Once the recycling plant had been laid to waste, the Twister would make its move on the subdivision. However, it's here where the storm's extremely unique nature would reveal itself once again. As it was ripping apart the homes in the subdivision, the tornado suddenly came to a virtual standstill. Now usually when a tornado comes to a stop, it's beginning to weaken, but that certainly wasn't the case here. In fact, if anything, the winds only intensified. Can you even imagine having a roaring beast directly over your head for literally minutes on end? Now that's truly a nightmare. For some reason, the dead man was no longer walking. Instead, he was standing still. The dead man remained stationary for minutes on end. The wind was so strong that it flattened well-made structures and homes, and even scoured the paint off of vehicles. Unfortunately, a family of 5 who resided within this subdivision would all lose their lives to this monster storm. Finally, the tornado begins to move again, although it's really only crawling across the ground at a snail's pace. Within the next neighborhood, lying in the direct path of the beast, a family would flee their home, due to it having inadequate protection against the wind. This family would take refuge in a nearby neighbor's home, thinking that they would be safer there. However, in a tragic and ironic turn of events, this home would suffer a direct hit from the tornado, and no one sheltering within its walls would survive. In fact, absolutely nothing would remain of this home after the ravenous beast was finished with it. This is an effect known as slabbing that can sometimes be seen in the very worst of storms. Luckily, it's extremely rare, but that fact would do nothing to help the residents of Jarrell, Texas on that fateful day. And only a few blocks away from this tragedy, yet another one occurred as a mother and her 2 daughters were killed when their home was hit by the Twister. And at that exact same time, just a few streets away, another horrible event was taking place. A brave father was shielding his family in their bathtub when the roof overhead was suddenly and violently ripped away. The heroic father did his very best to shield his family from the ferocious winds, but with each passing second, he could feel his grip beginning to weaken. And tragically, despite his best efforts, the storm consumed him. This tornado was so strong that if you were seeking shelter above ground instead of under it, then it was practically unsurvivable. Being underground makes all the difference, folks. Remember that. For instance, all 6 members of the Hernandez family survived due to taking cover in a storm shelter on their property, as their home was torn apart above them. However, their nearby neighbors who did not have a shelter on property wouldn't be so lucky, as they would tragically lose their lives to the storm. Another nearby storm shelter would help protect 18 separate lives from the fury of the wind. Without these shelters, there's no doubt that the death toll in Jarrell, Texas would have climbed even higher. But in total, 27 lives would be lost on that dark day. The utter damage and destruction left behind by this Twister was nothing short of extraordinary. Homes and businesses hadn't just been destroyed, they'd been completely wiped off the map. Where proud homes once stood, only their foundations remained. The unusual activity this storm exhibited only added to the carnage, especially its extremely slow movements. It was almost as though the dead man wanted to make absolutely sure that it completely destroyed everything in its path, leaving nothing behind. The destruction of the Double Creek Estate subdivision proved to be the grand finale for the Twister. Following the carnage there, the beast meandered through a field for a bit, before finally dissipating. The bodies of the victims were so damaged by the high winds, they could only be properly identified with the help of dental records. Things weren't all negative, though. As the search for survivors got underway, the mother and daughter who had hid in their bathtub were both found alive. It was truly a miracle, and the husband would eventually be recognized as the hero that he was. In the years following the disaster, the subdivision would be rebuilt. However, the storm had left a dark blight upon the community. 3 entire families had lost their lives, including 13 children. In the end, a memorial park would be built to honor the victims, with 27 trees planted to represent all of the lives lost. And so remember, if you ever see the dead man walking, hide, and hide underground.